Before the sun crested the Judean hills on the first morning of the week, something happened inside a sealed rock chamber on the outskirts of Jerusalem that would fracture history in two. Not metaphorically, literally. The Roman Empire, the most sophisticated military and administrative machine the ancient world had ever produced, had posted armed soldiers at a tomb. They had rolled a stone of estimated 2 to 4 metric tons across its entrance. They had pressed the official wax seal of the governor of Judea across that stone. And they had ordered those guards to stand watch through the night, under penalty of death if they failed. By dawn on the morning we now call Easter Sunday, every single one of those precautions had been rendered irrelevant. The stone had moved. The seal had shattered. The soldiers had fled. And the body of Jesus of Nazareth was nowhere to be found inside a tomb that had been placed under the full authority of Rome. What happened in those pre-dawn hours of the 1st century? What does the archaeology of Roman tomb security actually tell us? What does the Greek word used for the stone's movement reveal that our English translations obscure? And how did the most educated men of that era, Roman administrators, Jewish high priests, and secular chroniclers, attempt to explain what they themselves could not deny? The answers are older than the Church, older than the creeds, and they have been waiting, sealed inside primary sources and 1st century stone, for seekers willing to look. Welcome to Bible Secrets, Hidden History. Before we descend into the ancient evidence, consider joining our community of seekers by subscribing. If you believe this history deserves to be preserved and examined with the full weight of scholarship it demands, a simple like helps this truth reach those who seek it. Now, let us enter the tomb. Chapter 1. The Seal of Caesar. To understand the magnitude of what the empty tomb represents as a historical event, one must first understand what Rome built to prevent it. The Gospel of Matthew, written within living memory of the Crucifixion, records a specific and remarkable sequence of events. The chief priests and Pharisees did not simply request that Pilate post a guard. They told him precisely why. Quote, "Sir, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day." This is our first extraordinary detail. The religious leadership of Jerusalem was sufficiently alarmed by Jesus' own predictions about resurrection that they personally petitioned the Roman governor for military protection of a dead man's grave. This was not routine. This was unprecedented. Pilate's response is equally telling. The Greek text of Matthew 27:65 records him saying, "Echate custodian, you have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how." The word custodian is a direct Greek transliteration of the Latin custodia, a specialized Roman military term, not a generic word for watchman. A custodia was a rotating guard unit of 4 to 16 soldiers assigned in shifts to a specific post, operating under strict military protocol. The Roman military theorist Vegetius, writing in the 4th century but drawing on earlier traditions, describes the punishment for sleeping on guard duty as death by execution. A Roman soldier standing custodia over an imperial sealed tomb was not a bored sentinel. He was a man whose life was staked against the security of what he watched. And yet, the stone moved, the guard fled, and Rome's machinery of containment was broken before the morning sun reached the walls of the holy city. Chapter 2. The Stone and the Silence. The stone at the entrance of Jesus' tomb has become so embedded in religious iconography that we rarely stop to interrogate it as an archaeological object. We should. 1st century Jewish burial practices in the Jerusalem area are remarkably well documented, both through the Gospels themselves and through the extraordinary archaeological record preserved in the rock-cut tombs of Judea. Scholars such as Amos Kloner of Bar Ilan University, who has conducted exhaustive surveys of Second Temple period tombs around Jerusalem, identify two primary types of sealing stones used in elite burial chambers of this era. The first type is the golel, a disc-shaped stone, sometimes called a wheel stone, rolled along a cut groove in the bedrock in front of the tomb entrance. These were typically found at the wealthiest burials, the tomb of Herod's family, the ossuaries of the high priestly class, the tomb offered to Jesus by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, a man of considerable means, almost certainly employed this type of sealing stone. Kloner's research suggests these disc stones ranged in weight from 1 to 2 tons at their most modest, and significantly more in elaborate hewn chambers. The second type is the dophek, a more roughly shaped boulder wedged against the entrance. Simpler, less expensive, used for common burials in the hillside necropoles outside the city. Now here is what our English translations fail to convey. The Gospel of Mark, widely considered by scholars to be the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels, likely composed within 30 years of the Crucifixion, uses a specific and deliberately chosen Greek verb to describe what happened to the stone. Mark 16:4 says the women arriving at dawn looked up and saw that the stone had been apokuliō. This is the perfect passive indicative of the Greek verb apokuliō. It does not simply mean moved. It does not mean pushed aside. The prefix apo indicates separation, movement away from, removal from a previous position. The perfect tense in Greek denotes a completed action whose effects are still present. And the passive voice indicates the stone was not moved by those who arrived to find it moved. It had been acted upon by an external force, the action completed, the result standing before them as established reality. The stone, in the language of the original text, had been rolled away and remained away. This was not a door left ajar. This was a seal irrevocably broken. The women, Mark tells us in the same verse, had spent their journey to the tomb asking one another who could possibly roll this stone away for them. They knew its weight. They had watched it placed. And when they arrived, that impossible stone had already been removed by something or someone they had not anticipated. Chapter 3. The witnesses before Mary Magdalene reached the tomb, before Peter and John came running, before any of the 12 disciples stood at that open entrance, there were other witnesses, the Roman soldiers. This fact is perhaps the most under-examined element of the resurrection narrative in popular discussion, yet it is historically among the most significant. Matthew 28 records that some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. Everything. The guards themselves, trained Roman military personnel, men conditioned to face battlefield violence without flinching, were so disturbed by what they had witnessed that they abandoned their post and went to the very religious authorities who had commissioned them. They did not go to Pilate. They went to the priests. Why? Because they knew that what they had witnessed implicated the religious establishment directly, that the sealed tomb of the man those priests had executed was now empty. The priest's response is itself a document of extraordinary historical value. They bribed the soldiers. Matthew 28:12-13 records. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, 'His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep.'" Understand what this bribe was purchasing. A Roman soldier admitting to sleeping on custodia duty was confessing to a capital offense. Under Roman military law, the lex Julia Divi Publica, dereliction of guard duty was punishable by death, typically carried out by the soldier's own unit in the brutal ritual known as fustuarium, a beating by the batons and stones of one's fellow soldiers. The priests were not simply buying a cover story. They were asking these men to confess to a crime that could get them executed, and they promised to satisfy Pilate, to use their political relationship with the governor to shield the soldiers from punishment if the story came to his ears. No one offers this kind of bribe unless the alternative explanation is something they find even more dangerous than the cover story. The story the priests needed silenced was this: the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth was empty, the seal of Rome was broken, and the soldiers who had watched through the night could not explain it with any natural account. That bribe, recorded in Matthew's Gospel, circulating in Jerusalem while participants were still alive and falsifiable, is itself a testimony to the empty tomb. It is the testimony of those who needed it not to be true. Chapter 4. The linen and the logic. The disciples who entered the tomb that morning found it empty of the body of Jesus, but they did not find it empty of evidence. The Gospel of John, composed by the beloved disciple, or by those within his immediate circle drawing on his eyewitness account, gives us the most precise and archaeologically coherent description of what was found inside. John 26:7 records that Simon Peter entered and saw the othonia, the strips of linen burial cloth, lying in position. And he saw the sudarion, the facial cloth, not lying with the linen strips, but folded up in a place by itself, separate from the burial cloths. These details have generated centuries of theological reflection, but they carry a specific historical argument embedded in their plainness. First-century Jewish burial practice, attested in both the Talmudic literature and the physical evidence of excavated tombs around Jerusalem, involved wrapping the body with othonia, strips of linen wound tightly around the limbs and torso, and binding the jaw closed with a separate cloth. Scholars including the late Professor Frederick Zugebe, a forensic pathologist who spent decades studying ancient burial practices, have noted that the precise arrangement of these cloths, as John describes them, is inconsistent with grave robbery, but entirely consistent with a body that had departed the wrappings rather than been unwrapped from them. The cloths were undisturbed, still in their wound configuration, but the body they had enclosed was simply no longer inside them. Grave robbers, if they were somehow never intercepted by the Roman guard, and the physical impossibility of moving the stone without detection is set aside. Do not unwrap a corpse in a tomb and leave the cloths in perfect order. They take the body still wrapped for speed, or they strip it carelessly, leaving linen scattered and disordered. They do not fold the facial cloth and place it neatly to one side. The arrangement of the burial cloths is not a theological argument. It is a forensic one. Chapter 5. The explanations of the age. No serious scholar of the first century, no Roman administrator, no Jewish religious authority, no secular historian writing within a century of these events, ever claimed the tomb was not empty. That single fact deserves to be stated plainly and held in full weight. The debate in the first century was never about whether the tomb was empty. It was about why. The earliest counter-narrative, the one the priests purchased with a bribe to Roman soldiers, was the theft hypothesis. The disciples had stolen the body in the night. This explanation appears in Matthew's Gospel as an already circulating story, and it is echoed by the second-century Jewish writer referenced in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, where Trypho acknowledges that Jewish teachers of his day were still propagating the narrative that the disciples had stolen the corpse. But even the earliest critics of the Christian movement, working in the 1st and 2nd centuries, never produced a counterclaim that the tomb had simply never been empty, that Jesus had not died on the cross, or had been buried elsewhere, or that the women had gone to the wrong tomb. These are modern skeptical theories, constructed centuries after the fact. The contemporaries never said any of this. The Roman writer Celsus, whose arguments against Christianity are preserved in Origen's Contra Celsum, written in the mid-3rd century, but drawing on Celsus's 2nd century text, attacks the resurrection with ridicule and philosophical argument, but never with the most devastating argument available: that the tomb was still sealed, that the body was still inside, that eyewitnesses could confirm it. Celsus instead attacks the quality of the witnesses and the character of Jesus. He works around the empty tomb rather than against it, because the empty tomb was not in dispute. It was an embarrassing datum that required an explanation, not a fabrication that could be denied. The Flavian historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century in his Antiquities of the Jews, refers briefly to Jesus in the contested passage known as the Testimonium Flavianum, portions of which most scholars accept as authentic, even after accounting for later Christian interpolations. Even in its partially corrupted form, the passage notes that those who loved Jesus reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his death. Josephus does not refute this report. He records it as an active claim circulating within the community he is documenting. The empty tomb was the 1st century consensus. The disagreement was entirely about its cause. Chapter 6. The 500 and the Epistles. Here is something that reshapes our entire chronological understanding of the resurrection evidence. The earliest written account of the resurrection in the New Testament is not in any of the 4 Gospels. It is in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, a document almost universally dated by critical scholars to approximately 54 or 55 CE, and containing within it a creedal formula that Paul himself says he received and passed on, indicating the formula predates even this letter. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. New Testament scholars, including James D.G. Dunn of Durham University and the late Raymond Brown of Union Theological Seminary, have argued that the creedal formula Paul quotes in these verses can be traced through the language of received and passed on, which are the precise technical terms in both Greek, paralabon/paradoka, and their Hebrew equivalents, kibbul/masar, for the formal transmission of rabbinic tradition, to within 2 to 5 years of the crucifixion itself. Paul met with Peter and James in Jerusalem approximately 3 years after his conversion. This is where he received the formula, which places the core testimony of the resurrection in approximately 35 to 38 CE, barely 5 years after the events themselves. And Paul's argument in that passage is deliberately empirical. He cites 500 eyewitnesses, most of whom he says are still alive at the time of writing. This is an invitation to verification. In a 1st century Mediterranean world where travel between Corinth and Jerusalem was a viable undertaking for those with means and motivation, Paul is essentially saying, go ask them. The witnesses are still there. No one can make this argument fraudulently, not in the ancient world, not in any world. If the 500 did not exist, or had not seen what Paul claimed they had seen, the entire apologetic collapses in front of the very audience it is addressed to. Conclusion: the open loop resolved. We began this investigation in the gray pre-dawn of the first morning of the week, before the sun crested the Judean hills, before anyone understood what had happened. We asked, what does the historical record actually tell us about that morning? Here is what the full weight of first-century evidence, examined without theological prejudice in either direction, actually shows. A tomb was sealed under the authority of Rome. A guard was posted. The stone, a rolling disc of 2 tons or more, was placed in a groove cut for it in the bedrock and sealed with the wax imprint of Pontius Pilate. All of this is recorded in a document circulating in Jerusalem within the generation that remembered it, in a community that included enemies of the movement who never disputed the basic facts. The stone was found in the apokuliō, rolled away and remaining away, in the irrevocable perfect tense of the Greek original. The burial cloths were undisturbed, the facial cloth folded, arranged in a manner inconsistent with theft and consistent with something unprecedented. The guards fled and reported not to their Roman commander, but to the religious authorities who had commissioned them, and those authorities paid a significant sum of money to bury a story they could not afford to have circulate. No contemporary, not Roman, not Jewish, not hostile to the Christian movement, ever produced the body. No authority ever pointed to a grave and said, "Here, he is still here." The debate was always about why the tomb was empty, never about whether it was. And within 5 years of the crucifixion, a creedal formula was circulating in Jerusalem, naming 500 living eyewitnesses to the risen Jesus. A claim made by a man who had personally met and questioned the closest companions of Jesus, who had every scholarly, legal, and personal reason in the ancient world to destroy this movement if it were built on fraud. The mystery introduced in those pre-dawn hours has never been resolved by natural explanation. Not by the priests who funded the theft theory. Not by the philosophers who attacked the witnesses. Not by the centuries of critics who have worked around the empty tomb, because working against it was historically indefensible. What happened inside that sealed rock chamber in Jerusalem may be the most consequential unanswered question in the history of the human record. The evidence does not tell the seeker what to believe, but it demands, with the full weight of first-century stone and text and sworn testimony, that the question be taken with absolute seriousness. The tomb was empty. On that, the ancient world agreed. Everything else is what divides us. This has been Bible Secrets, Hidden History. If this investigation moved you, if it opened a door you did not know existed in the stone walls of the ancient world, share it with someone who is searching. Subscribe, so that when the next sealed archive is opened, you are here when it happens. The next chapter of this hidden history reaches back even further, into the events of the hours before the tomb was sealed, into the chamber of Pilate and the language of his judgment. A question that Rome tried to answer in 3 languages, written above a dying man's head, that still reverberates across 20 centuries of human civilization. Stay with us. The truth is older than the silence that has kept it.